Sometimes we do not understand ourselves or the world around us. Sometimes it is hard to make such distinctions, and sometimes it is hard to understand such feelings and such thoughts. Often it is the case within the world we live in which people do not understand the world around us. They do not understand anything because they themselves are incapable of understanding. And often that is the way the world is. It is a sad world indeed. It is a world in which people do not want to live within because to know this cold hard fact would either make or break an individual. Sometimes it is hard to understand such distinctions within society because it requires an ability in which very few people have. Sometimes it is hard to understand the world. Sometimes it is hard to understand the world for what it is, because to understand the world would require a perspective beyond the capability of what individuals are frankly able to understand. It would require a perspective beyond what most are capable of feeling or understanding. And there lies the end line, is that most people just simply cannot understand the world for what it is. And those who do are often jaded, twisted individuals who are consumed with sorrow, sadness, and hatred. And unfortunately, that is the grim reality of what the world is. And those who understand the world often cannot make any distinctions between happiness or sadness, because sometimes people like to be sad. They like to be filled with sorrow, and often that is the case about the world we live in, is that people like to be sad, hateful, and often like to play the victim, because that is all they have, because they don't see themselves as anything more or less than what they are. And as such, they just view the world as a lost cause. And often that is the way people are. And it is a sad world to live in. It is a world in which very few people do not want to understand. Because to ever understand the world in such a way, it has a way of diminishing anything that is good or decent within a person. And often it is like chains that weigh you down, that make you incapable of wanting to pursue any happiness of any kind. And often that is just the way the world is. Because if you could see all the bad for what it was, would you be a better person? In a great deal of cases, certainly not. It has a way of changing a person, predominantly not for the better, and normally for good. A person is changed when they see so much bad and so much wrong and so much immorality, to which they themselves eventually lose anything that is good or decent, and they become stuck-up assholes because they themselves cannot see the good any longer. Which goes back to my previous point. In such a way, if a person is able to see the world for what it is, often it doesn't make a person happier. Rather, in fact, it makes it all the more worse. But at the same time, there are people out there that do learn from such turns of events within their lives. And sometimes you don't need a perspective to understand the world if you have already experienced the hardship of what this world presents. One does not need to understand the world to know that it is a sad place, and one does not need to be all wise or all knowing to know what the world is. All it takes is having common sense, people. Often that's a misunderstood term because, well, people do not want to have common sense, and you wonder why people are even more miserable and sad, to which they themselves have literally done nothing with themselves, and then they play the victim. It is a wonder why the world is the way it is. But there lies the in line right then and there, is that when they themselves see the world in such a defeatist mentality, they do not want to improve themselves. They do not want to do anything with themselves. Rather, they simply throw down in defeat. And they just give up. While at the same time being complete total pricks. In such cases, you don't need a perspective. You don't need to be a highly intelligent person to understand the world. But at the same time, it would greatly benefit a person if they want to improve themselves and want to learn from their mistakes. And sometimes that is hard. And sometimes it can be more or less overwhelming because it requires so much of what a person is capable of doing. To understand the world is not an easy thing, and often it comes with a great deal of price, to which individuals within society ultimately pay for knowing such things. And as such, it is not an easy thing to understand. And as such, people cannot understand why the world is the way it is, even though they claim to understand they don't. And often it makes the most rotten of human beings within society, because people often want to know what the world is, and when they experience it, it sort of wounds their capability of having a decent perspective of what the world is. And as such, they lose themselves. They lose the ability to be good-hearted, decent people. And as such, you wonder why there are such rotten people within society. Sometimes it is hard to understand the world, but that is the way the world is. And often individuals who say they want to know it often cannot understand the ramifications for wanting such thing, because to understand the world would require one to change their perspective greatly, because if not, thus they will lose themselves. And that is something that people do not understand, is that if they themselves are incapable of doing that much, of changing their perspective to know what is the good and what is the bad, then they themselves should never have attempted to try. Because to do so, in a sense, they have lost themselves. They have, in a sense, what you would call poisoning their minds with all kinds of negative things, to which it has simply just rot them from the inside out, because they refuse to adapt, to change their way of thinking, or to be able to cope with what they wanted to know. Such that is quite a problem within society, because people are arrogant and ignorant and assuming that they themselves know everything when they clearly don't. They don't know what the world is. And that is something that literally makes a person regret wanting to know what the world was, in a sense, because they themselves wanted to know the world in a sense to which they themselves thought they could deal with it, when in fact they could not. And as such, they lose themselves. They end up corrupting their way of thinking, and they begin to rot from the inside out, because they themselves wanted to know what the world is, but then ultimately could not deal with it. So as such, you get what you wanted,